So it's great to have everybody. This is John Sherwood. Thank you guys so much for being here. I've got with me Dr. Mark Baker, who insists that I call him Mark. So we're going to do that. Mark is the author of Centered Set Church. Me and several other church leaders and pastors have been reading this and talking through it. And I'm so grateful that we get a chance to talk with the author, with you, Mark, today to just kind of pick your brain a little bit more, maybe ask some questions that perhaps you didn't cover or did cover in the book, and for us to kind of process together as a group.
And I grew up in the Northeast United States. My father's a Christian camp director. Well, yeah, that's in the book. So yeah, actually, you guys know a fair bit about me from reading the book. But yeah, I was a missionary in Honduras for a while with the University Christian Fellowship in upstate New York, and did my doctorate in theology at Duke. So I spent 4 years in North Carolina, and then after going back to Honduras, taught at a seminary in Fresno, California for 25 years, a Mennonite Brethren seminary.
And one of the questions I wanted to ask is, what was it that first prompted you to write this book? And like, what gave you the motivation? Like, what was it that initially just sparked this whole project?
Okay. Yeah. And first I say, I am thrilled to have this opportunity to interact with you today. I'm glad you're reading the book, and it's great to be able to have conversation with people who have read it. So yeah, two things. I mean, one, this didn't spark me to write the book, but just, when I first encountered these concepts from Paul Hiebert, it just brought together, it gave language to things I had been struggling. Like if you go look at my dissertation in the Duke Library, I think it says freedom from legalism or something like that. And legalism is just too narrow of a term. And anyways, I love the concepts, but felt he's written it, it's out there, lots of people talking about it. So really the specific thing that led me to read this book was feeling a lack when I would explain it to my students in class. I'd present it, and then often in class they would say, "Okay, Mark, this sounds good, but what do I do, about church membership? Or what's this? I've got this situation going on in my church where this and this is happening. How do I do that? How do I approach that in a centered way?" And the reality was, I encountered this concept after I had left Honduras, after I'd done my intervarsity ministry. So I was a seminary professor, leading a jail Bible study, but not, I wasn't pastoring, leading. And so when students asked me those questions, I would say, I don't know. I would then say, well, let's think about it together, something like that. But I felt this lack of, but also, PhDs were sort of walking bibliographies and just loved to be able to say, oh, what you should do is read this book. And there was no book I could turn to, and that frustrated me. So really that is the genesis of the motivation for writing this book, is the lack of a resource to give to my students. And then, an important thing I could say for this conversation today is, but I couldn't write the book, right? I mean, if I couldn't, if I'm in class and can't answer the question, how am I going to write a book about it? So in order to write the book, right, I had to go out and talk to people like yourselves who were seeking to practice a centered approach. And so I want to start with that too, is like, I feel like in one hand, I'm an expert. Like I've thought about this a lot, and I thought very carefully about how to communicate it. But the only expertise I have is expertise I have gathered from others. So I will share with you today things I've learned from others, and I will take notes on things you say that will, add to things I have to share with others in the future.
Well, thank you. And, by continuing the way of introduction, I mean, you've got 5 practitioners here. We're all church leaders, and we've all been in ministry for some time. And just to kind of give you some backdrop too, I'm going to try to paint with a little bit of a broad brush. This isn't 100% applicable for every one of us, but we all do share some heritage. And I think that this book resonates with me, and I think with many of us, because of sort of our theological frameworks and heritages. And I think it would be safe to say that we all have come from what probably would be considered by most to be kind of a bounded set. Some may say really bounded, which I know is not unique to our heritage. We kind of are an offshoot of the Restoration movement and Churches of Christ and things of that branch of the tree. And we're all at different places kind of on that theological heritage branch now, and in different places in terms of this centered set idea. I was the first one, I believe, in this group to encounter your work through Jesus Collective, another Anabaptist sort of group that I came into contact with. And I read it probably 2 years ago or so, and I started working with some of my leaders here with some of this material and these concepts and trying to think through and it was really dovetailing well into what we were doing as a congregation and trying to understand where are we putting lines in the sand and are they the right lines, and if there are lines that need to change, how do we do that? And it's just all these kinds of ideas that were around a myriad of issues and situations and people and structures and how do we make Christians, and what does it mean what is our conversion theology and where does that come from, and do we have those lines in the right place, and so on and so on and so on and so on and so on. And so finally, after kind of working through this a little bit with my local congregation, I started talking to some of my other pastor friends, and that's how this kind of cohort came about. And we've been kind of working through some of this for the last 4 or 5 months and meeting together and talking about it. And so I'd like to offer an opening question, and then if any of the other guys on the call, obviously we don't have any women on the call right now, but many of our wives are also in the vocational ministry. Some are not. I would love if they were able to be a part of this conversation, but for the time that we have now, they weren't able to be. But I'd love for the guys to jump in here in a minute. But what just in general, you wrote this book. I don't have the copyright date right in front of me. When was it written?
Well,
21
it came
is
out
what I've got.
very late 21, early 22. So,
okay. Yeah. So it's not been out too long, just a few years. But what are some of the responses that you've seen from the book? If you were to kind of overview or summarize what you think the impact of the book has had or is having, what would you say?
Let's see. Well, I've had a number of, and I probably have, more sense of response from when I've gone out. I've taught, presented it at, different denominational gatherings, things like that, and probably get more sense of feedback then from people writing me and telling me. But, a line I said is fairly common that people will say, this is really helpful. This gives, this gives language to things I have felt, and I've heard that both from leaders, but also it's been quite moving to me, to have regular congregants come up to me and say, I felt this in my being, but this gives me, so that's been a very positive response, and then I think. I guess the engagement has been more at people wanting to talk about, as I imagine you will be, is okay, but what does that mean in this kind of situation? So I think people have been very grateful for the numerous examples in the book, and it feels like that gives them a place to start. But overall positive, and a desire, sharing, telling others. Have had a number of pastors, write to me and say, I'm doing a series on this at my church. And I've really only had one strongly negative response. And I think that was in part because the person was responding to some conflict going on in the denomination. And there were some other people. So the people that were in a disagreement with him about the particular issue were saying they were centered. And I don't know if they were misusing the term or if it's just because they disagreed about the issue that he was upset with centered. But and but he was pretty strongly negative. But other than that, the response have been positive. Yeah, I think
Yeah.
oh, maybe
Yeah.
one other thing. It's a thing that I'm pleased with, and I hope you pick this up in the book, is like I worked very hard to make this a book that would work for, you Church of Christ related to, someone Episcopalian, Presbyterian Church
Yes.
USA, Mennonite, Southern Baptist. Like I didn't want people to trip on my theology. So I have theology and I've written other books about it, and so it's been gratifying to me that I have gotten communication from a pretty broad spectrum. And I've done podcasts from Southern Baptist to Episcopalian, Mennonite, and Nazarene. And so that is gratifying to me, because I've worked hard for that to be the case.
And I think that comes through, that ecumenicalism, I think, shines, because I was going to actually give just a brief overview of like how I conceptualize the heartbeat of the book for any of those online that may watch this later and haven't come into contact with the book yet. You talk about there's this kind of spectrum, and on these two ends of the spectrum, you have a bounded set and what you call a fuzzy set. And all of this is obviously borrowed from Hiebert, and you reference his work there, and I've had a chance to go and read his work as well. But and you're talking about this centered way, that this bounded way, which I think can often be thought of as like legalism, or just an over dogmatism, or in the wrong ways. And then fuzzy set on the other side of the spectrum is kind of like almost like a relativism, just that there are no lines, no definitions, everything is just fuzzy, and that Jesus, you make an argument that Jesus actually walks this middle way, and you're advocating for us as Jesus followers and as communities of Jesus followers and churches and ministries or whatever to find ways to navigate as individuals and communities in a centered way. And you outline all of this, and you give a lot of practical examples around membership and church discipline and all sorts of things. But one of the things that I loved that you did early in the book is you said every group of people, and this is me paraphrasing obviously, and I haven't like reviewed the book super recently, but every community of believers are going to be responsible to define that center for themselves. And the language that you use is like making Jesus the center. But I think you even go out of your way to say, but even saying Jesus is the center has to be more clearly defined. And I'm not going to define that for you, because that's when we get into the theology of how we understand Jesus and the scriptures, our hermeneutic, et cetera. But every community is going to have to do that. And I think if I'm so bold, I think that's the journey that all of us as church leaders have been on, is looking at and examining what center have we inherited, and what do we want to keep and what do we not, and why, right? We're kind of like looking at how do we redefine the center. And so your book is helpful in that way to get us to do that, but it's unhelpful in that you won't do it for us. Yeah. But I think that that's great. And I think, I know that it takes a lot of discipline to not do that, especially when you do have a definition of how to define Jesus. You do have theology. So I appreciate that. But yeah, let me open it up to the guys here on the call. I mean, what kind of questions would you have for Mark, and how as you are thinking about trying to implement or wrestle with these Jesus-centered or centered set concepts in your local ministry context and in your life personally? Just feel free to jump in.
All right. I'll jump in. Got a couple questions. First of all, I do appreciate, Mark, what you just shared, because I noticed it in the book, right? Is that I think equal treatment of like the entire spectrum. And I know for sure I appreciated reading that. I definitely identified myself in one area, but I did feel like there was equal treatment given on the spectrum between bounded and fuzzy. So here's where I find myself that would be helpful, I think, is although I can certainly identify historically like a bounded church paradigm that I've really been trained up in for sure. But I also find even in my little congregation here, we're pretty equally distributed between people who adhere to a bounded church view and a fuzzy church view.
Mm.
And it's almost like along generational lines. It's definitely our kind of older congregants and brothers and sisters very much adhere and have been trained up in that. But simultaneously, our college students, our high school students, our young professionals and young singles are equally on the other side. And so I'm curious about navigating that, because using this language, man, it kind of can trigger both, sometimes in a good way and sometimes in opposite ways, right? And so I don't know. I mean, that's was a question that kind of came to my mind as I have this kind of like melting pot of
Yeah,
bounded fuzzies.
that no that you present a great sort of little case study, and to acknowledge, Keith, it's more challenging when you have both in the same church. So like if you said, hey, like I've got this fuzzy congregation, how do I respond? That would be easier to answer than I've got, or I've got abounded. But when you have both, so let me make a few observations, and I want to mildly confront a word that John used, to say middle way. And I think part of the beauty, the significance, the importance of Hiebert's centered way is that it's off, it's not on the same continuum. So centered is not halfway in between bounded and fuzzy, which I know John, but I think it's important to realize, this is a wholly other thing. Now, so let's think about for the bounded people. And no, let me first say, Keith, like in my years, so like what John alluded to with you, I mean, I'm as you know, from reading the book, the first chapter, I'm from a bounded set background. And so in my classes, I only talked about bounded and centered, because centered is the remedy for bounded. But then what you observed, Keith, is I started noticing more and more my students were fuzzy. And so then I went back, read Hiebert, and I started talking about fuzzy. Okay, now why I think it's very important that when we talk about this with people in churches, we talk about all three and not just bounded and centered or fuzzy and centered. Because why are there are people in bounded churches, I believe, that recognize the downsides of it, that don't like the judgmentalism, the line drawing, but they also are convinced these beliefs and behaviors are very important. And what's the alternative they see to boundedness is fuzziness. And they know they don't like that. So for you as leaders, when you talk about this, if you present, you don't just talk about bounded and centered, but you also talk about fuzzy, then that does an important thing for the bounded people in your church. It lets them know that you too recognize that fuzziness is a problem. Because, and this is an interesting thing, when I presented this, my first 10 years of teaching, maybe first 15, there were always students that would argue with me. Not many, but there'd always be two or three that would try to stick up for boundedness. But the interesting thing is happening once I started talking about fuzzy as well. The students stopped arguing with me because they realized, like Mark doesn't, what they were concerned about, they realized, Mark's concerned about that too. So one thing, Keith, and all of you, I think it's really important to talk about all three. But now let's go to the other side. The fuzzy people, what are they concerned about? Like, they know they don't like judgmentalism. And so it's not that they're necessarily against clarity of beliefs and behaviors, But what they have experienced is they've experienced clarity of beliefs and behaviors in bounded ways. They know they don't want that. And so, if the line is the problem, as I say in the book, well, then erase the line. That's the solution. So I think, letting the fuzzy people know, hey, I'm not bounded, then that lowers the temperature there. But yeah, frankly, I think fuzzy is probably a bigger challenge than bounded, because I think, fuzzy people are so wary of anything that sounds, strict, sounds like conviction. They relate it to bounded and they're resistant to it. So that's one thing. Another problem that I've observed is, in presenting this, I'm not inside people's heads and experiences, so I'm not sure on this, but it seems like bounded people don't tend to not misunderstand themselves as being centered. But fuzzy people, I find, more commonly think they're centered because they think, oh yeah, I'm not bounded, so I'm centered. When a lot of times, people are maybe more fuzzy than they think. Let me say one more thing, then I've talked for a long time and I'll let you or others respond to this. But and this was from a pastor who is in a church that she acknowledges is a pretty fuzzy church. And I was in a webinar sort of thing, actually with Jesus Collective. It was Megan Good. And someone asked her, well, okay, so what do how do you move your church to be more centered? And one thing she said, which I thought was very wise, is she said, I like in their new members classes now, she has a session on bounded, fuzzy, and centered. And she said, because I want this to be, part of people's understandings is we're centered. And so I think it's really important that these are not just ideas that the leadership circle, talks about and understands, but that people in the groups, in the congregations, have an understanding of what centered is. So that, because then when that allows you, when you're in conversations with people, to refer to this and to say, but wait a minute, we're not that. And okay, yeah. So as I said, I talked a lot. Thoughts, responses,
No, yeah, that's
or
good.
others?
That's good. I think I just wanted to respond real quickly that in my experience so far, coming from a bounded place and most of the people that I'm talking to, that's always almost always the first reaction is there's this fear of becoming fuzzy. And so I appreciate you sharing that for sure. And I know that, and I do apologize for creating this kind of linear concept of, two ends of a pole and Jesus walking a centered way. One of the things that struck all of us here in my local congregation the most right at first was the well and fence analogy.
Mm-hmm.
I think that metaphor, that story just, I think, depicts what you're talking about so well, that instead of building fences to keep cattle and other livestock in when you don't have the resources, you dig a well, and that naturally intrinsically keeps the animals from wandering too far off. And we've been wrestling with that for the better part of 2 years of what does it look like for us as a Jesus community to dig a well around Jesus? What does that mean? And so, I super appreciate that. Anybody else? Just jump in.
Yeah, thank you, Keith, for what you shared. I feel like a very similar paradigm in our ministry. We have bounded, and I'm, coming from, there are times I feel like I'm all three as well. But what practices do you feel like are important in creating a centered set culture in the paradigm that we're struggling with, where I'm coming out of the bounded set and wrestling with the fear of am I upholding the standard of scripture and discipleship that I'd like to see reflected in the world, becoming more like Christ, but also striving hard to untrain the judgmental attitude? What has helped you overcome those things, if that makes sense? Like I don't know if that question makes much sense.
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. And yeah, Tim, I mean, you stirred up quite a number of things in me. I mean, so even for instance, when you said, I feel like I'm all three, like, I think that's a great thing to acknowledge. And I think I say this in the book, but, in the book, I'm going for clarity. And so, I bounded, fuzzy, centered, these really distinct things. But the reality is, there's still a lot of boundedness in my being from decades in that, and probably some fuzzy reaction to it. And certainly in churches as well. I think, and this is when I give presentation, I would say, the question as you're sitting here listening to me is not to be sort of scurrying around figuring out, okay, are we bounded, fuzzy, centered? And then you're like, oh yeah, okay, we're centered, we're okay. But to ask, how can we become more centered? Because that's true for all of our congregations. And you can keep asking it, how can we become more centered? So that's one thing. So thanks for that observation. So yeah, let me give like a personal example. And I think this is in the book too, but for me, I found that there's just so much boundedness in my being that I, for a couple years, just continually read Karl Barth sermons. And I don't know if you're familiar with Karl Barth, but he's, he was probably the most significant theologian in the 20th century, but Swiss, Reformed, but very, very strong on God's action, God's initiative. God is for us. So a very strong, grace. But a very, using the words of the book, a very indicative preacher. So emphasizing what God has done. And because growing up in a setting that even though, we were very clear on the gospel, we're saved by grace, not works, but then we would talk so much about what we ought to be doing. So I felt like that was something to just wash it out of my own system. And so I say that to say, to be compassionate toward yourselves this is not just flipping a switch. And so give yourself time, but also to be intentional. Now, in a congregation, and this is a point where I think I'll say, Tim, I don't know the full answer to that because I have not pastored a congregation since I wrote the book. But I will say some things that I have observed that I think contribute to it in church settings. So one is chapter 6 in the book, where I talk about ethical exhortations, because this is important. And here I was just interacting with a couple months ago with a friend who's a pastor in Honduras, who had read the book in Spanish, and she acknowledged to me that she was not doing any sort of strong call, strong exhortation, because out of reaction to the very strong finger pointing kind of sermons that she'd grown up with. But she said chapter 6 was very helpful to her, giving her ways of doing exhortation, calling to change, but to do so in a way that is hopefully helping people to not hear it in a bounded way. So again, back to Keith's observation. So I think doing things like that, having strong, clear calls to change, to action, is very important both ways, because it's letting bounded people know, it's not that our pastor has given up on the importance of, spending time with God daily or something, but my hope would be over time, they would start feeling the difference if you're not talking about those things in a way that communicates, and if you don't do this, you're not a good Christian, you're not one of us, something like that. So one, I just say, hey, read chapter 6, work at it, and be very intentional with it. The other thing is, I would, and there's, what chapter is this in? There's a list of questions. Page 164, 65. And not to say use all those questions, but just think, what are some questions we can adopt in our congregation that we're going to use just all the time, regularly? What is your next step? I mean, just think, if you're using that kind of language all the time, again, it's not fuzzy, but it's avoiding bounded. So I would say some intentionality in language. And then, I guess I'll say 2 more things. One, I think at the discipleship level and pastoral counseling, I think is where the great opportunity is of when people are expecting a bounded response, for you to communicate. I love the example of Father Boyle from the gang ministry in Los Angeles, where he fires the guy. But before he fires him, he says, there is nothing you can do that will put you outside of my love or God's love. And so to lead with those kind of statements, I think, is a way of diffusing boundedness as well. And then to repeat what I said before, I think introducing the language so you can refer to it.
Thank you. I know that's our theme for the year, is intentional discipleship for our churches. Like for each individual to, what about Jesus do they want to become more like this year? And they're coming back, and we're praying about that together, and for everybody in the church to feel like there's some progress in their walk with Christ, mm-hmm. and transformation, and not just allowing life to come and, at the end of a year or decade, you're like, what's changed? I'm still struggling. And so hopefully, there'll be some growth together.
Yeah. And Tim, a beautiful thing about that too is, because you're not imposing, this is the list of things that a Christian, a good Christian ought to be doing. Let's work on it this year. I'm just imagining the center diagram as you're talking, and people are, they're in different places, but there can be a sense of all of us are progressing towards the center, even if in relation to different things.
Thank you so much. Go ahead, jump in, somebody.
Yeah, good stuff. I appreciate your book, your graciousness toward the folks in a bounded paradigm. I think that's really helpful, especially as I contemplate who else in our congregation could read this. I think your graciousness makes it easy to wrestle with some of the concepts. But I guess a question I have is, how much should a minister like myself embody some of this stuff before you even start teaching it? Because, sometimes you could get ahead of it, mm-hmm. and you're like, hey, let's do this. And then you actually like, I don't know what's non-negotiable, and how do I communicate in a centered way the non-negotiables, as you mentioned, like being a Mennonite, et cetera. So how long, I guess is a more practical question, how long do you think a minister should attempt to embody a more centered way of reading the scriptures, walking with Jesus, and before they start saying, okay, let me invite the rest of the church in this journey if they're interested?
I guess I would go more on the short side than the long side, because again, going with the Mennonite example. So the example I use in the book with the pastor from Seattle, is about Christian pacifism. Well, it's not like he needed time to decide whether that's part of his center, whether he believes that or not. The challenge is, how do I talk about this in a centered way? How do I
Preach.
how do I respond when other people don't comply with this center of ours? So this is, so on one hand, when you say Church of Christ, like we're really bound and set, that's our background. Like, yeah, I'm nodding, right? I mean, I had, a colleague at the seminary, the Church of Christ, I had students at Church of Christ, and I think, oh yeah. But at the same time, as you were saying that, I felt like saying to you guys, like, hey, like, you're not particularly more bounded than others. I mean, you may have some things that other churches looked at and say, wow, they are really strict about that. That's a little over. But, mainline liberal progressive churches can be just as bounded as any Church of Christ out there. It's just they use different things to draw the lines. So from my perspective, it's not so much figuring out, well, what is part of our center or is not, but as you maybe do that work, just work at treating things you think are important in centered ways. And you can start doing that this week. And that's not to say, oh yeah, and then you have it all down. But yeah. So you said preach, John. I'll invite your comment in a moment. But I guess my thought is it's very important for you to have clarity on these concepts and have some ideas on what it means for you to do things in a more centered way. But I would think introduce it to your congregation sooner rather than later. Yeah, John, what were you?
I'm going to briefly respond because most of these guys know the backstory of that comment. But I want to hear from the other guys too first. But Steve, this has been a lot of what I and we have been doing, right? Is the very thing you talked about. And I think that what I would add to Mark's comment is that if you aren't clear on your theological center, or you are uncertain or perhaps you think it may be shifting in some way than what it has been historically, if you want to communicate about that, I think honesty is key. And just to say, hey, this is where I'm at currently. This is what I'm thinking. This is why. But like, resist the urge perhaps to treat it as dogmatism of like, okay, because you know what? In 10 years, you may change your mind again. God may reveal, so I think just holding things in a humble posture to say, hey, this is, especially if that you're like, I'm not so sure of my confidence in this, but I don't think it's nothing. And I think it probably warrants some more discussion. So I think just be honest and forthright about your own uncertainty and your own like shifts and change, right? Like I've had to do that with my congregation, with my family, my wife, to go, guys, like my theology is shifting, and that doesn't happen overnight, but just to be open and to talk about that, I think with some trusted friends, advisors, counselors, and then with that counsel and prayer, et cetera, kind of learning, okay, when do we start to try to bring this to a more public forum, and when's best to do that? And I think any local community will be best served to be able to help guide and navigate that as you rely on the Spirit's wisdom, et cetera. But those are the thoughts that come to my mind, is that, I think to Mark's point, I don't think you have to wait until like you're fully baked and like, okay, I'm dogmatic about this, now I'm going to present it. I mean, I think it's okay to share as a leader, like I'm in the process of transformation continually. And to do that in a wise and healthy way, obviously. But it's tricky to discern exactly what that might mean in a given circumstance. I'll save the preach comment towards the end, Mark, because I might
Okay.
want to cut.
So,
I might want to cut it from the public audio.
So to thanks, John. And yeah, that brings a further thought in my mind of I feel like these are two different things of theological questioning, transformation, shifting is one thing, and it may be related to your leaving a bounded approach, but it would not. Yeah, to shift to a centered approach does not necessarily require any changes in ideas about beliefs, behaviors, or ethics. It's treating those things in a different way. So, Steve, I would, back to your question, I guess I would try in your own mind to separate these things so that when you're talking to your congregation, it's two different conversations. So when you're talking about being centered, have in your mind, and we're talking about things that like you have clarity on, and that's what you're going to work on being centered. And then if you want to also have conversations about, this thing we have, I'm not sure about it, that's a fine thing to do, but don't present that as we're having this conversation because we're centered. And now they're related. But I just think for the benefit of the congregation, it would be helpful to get them separate so that they don't, because otherwise they could confuse seeking to become more centered with changing beliefs. And I don't think that's necessary.
Yeah, I think I was speaking more to what you were talking about, the thought process of operating out of a centered position where, as you said, the communication of it is key, like the exhortation passage you were talking about. I know you mentioned repentance and how you could talk about that in a centered way, and just like, okay, how much of that do I want to, which you answered shorter rather than long, like how much of that do I want to look at what I believe about repentance, what I believe about faith, and what I believe about baptism, and discipleship and community, etc. And how much should I really embody that? Because I do sometimes, I think anyone, like you said, is still there in the heart. Both, all three, as Tim mentioned, all three are there in the heart. Before I start to be like, okay, I'm operating less from a place of hypocrisy. If I'm practicing, if I'm preaching, guys, we want to have great marriages, and I knew my marriage was awful, I would tell someone in a less theological way, strengthen your marriage, strengthen it, love well, and then after you feel like you're in a really good spot, be a blessing. So that was more the heart of the question.
Yeah.
But thank you for the feedback, both you guys, John and Mark.
Yeah, I got a question. Thanks for all this. It's been great. I think a lot of times when I read things and process things, it comes from maybe two lenses, right? Reading it through a leadership perspective and then an individualistic perspective. And I think when I think through some of these things, that's what I encounter a lot. I mean, we have a larger staff, right? So I think, how do you work this through a large staff and a congregation? But I think maybe my first part of the question would be with the individual. Obviously, in the 30 somethings, the 40 somethings, you're in this kind of examining your beliefs stage of what you grew up in, possibly. And I think even just as recent as yesterday, I had a conversation with, somebody who's kind of dealing with that bounded beliefs and trying to get out of that. And so I guess the question would be, have you seen successful being a guide and a support to individuals as they, not just throw the baby out with the bathwater, but examine some of these things as, that I can support and help?
Yes, definitely success in. I mean, in the sense that I've been a professor for 25 years, so most of my interaction about bounded, centered, and fuzzy has been with a group like this. Not like this, but with a group rather than in one church. So I've had numerous students who I've walked with in this way. But Kyle, an interesting thing, and it kind of surprised me. I think it was April or May, a former student invited me to come preach to his church on Centered Set Church. And you can imagine, like, I've got my 25-minute Centered Set, presentation down and ready. But he said, could you talk about it at the individual level? And I realized whenever I talk about Centered Set, I always talk congregation, group, ministry. I always talk about how can the church become more centered. So I think, and it was a really helpful exercise. Let me think, okay, well, what does that mean if I'm talking to an individual about how they can live in a more centered way? And that really is a different question. And I appreciated the opportunity to think about it in kind of recognizing, how are we treating ourselves? So I believe Jesus, the God revealed by Jesus, is looking at us as, through eyes of love and compassion, as I articulate in the book. But I think there's a lot of room to be working with people to sort of, do what my wife calls inner evangelism of themselves. How are you treating yourselves? And I'm, if you give me a moment, let me.
I was going to say, can you just share that sermon with us?
Yeah, I think I have it. Let me.
I like that concept, inner evangelism.
Yeah, for sure. Mark, if you want, if you could just shoot me that link or video or audio file or whatever, I can make sure that it's included here with this group and anybody that comes behind me and watches this.
I will do that. I found it. Yeah. So what I did is I'd forgotten I'd done this. I made a 14-minute sort of condensed just on that question. So sort of a short version of the sermon, which I can send to you, great question, Kyle.
What else is lingering out there?
Follow-up question to that is, I think from a leadership perspective, as John said, he's walked through this with his people who serve in their micro churches in all sorts of ways, but in a large staff, right? There's 14, of us full-time on staff in a large church. Have you seen the day in and day out execution of this succeeding in a large congregation, large staff working its way through all those, and maybe what was a positive from it?
Yes. So I have, well, let me to make an observation that sort of sets that up, which is, I think, implicit in your question, but like Kyle, you can't do this on your own, right? I mean, in the sense, like, you can't just read this book and start to being centered if you're in a context where others aren't doing the same thing. I mean, you still can do it, and it'll be a positive thing for people you're interacting with when you're preaching. Like, I'm not saying, sorry, Kyle, you can't do anything, but for the transformation to happen in a centered way in a congregation, in a small church, it can't be just the pastor, and in a large church, it can't just be one person. So the churches that I've seen where I've been most impressed is where either the group, the leadership group, read the book together and then talked about how are we going to do this, or they watched, one former student of a very large church in California that, I'm guessing they have, 25 on staff. And what he did is the pastor got the video series from Jesus Collective and watched the videos with the whole staff. So I think, in some way, whether it's the pastor preaching a series, a number of people have said to me they've done a series on Galatians and use my commentary on that, which was written from a center perspective, or gotten the leadership to do it, or, small groups do the videos, but some way of bringing a critical mass of people in that are working at it. And then the great thing too is, and like back to that list of questions on page 164, one of them, Scott Carolyn, you talk about sitting with, elders or senior leaders in the church, and they would say, okay, how are we going to respond to this in a centered way? And I hope you can just feel like the difference that would make of whether it's you sitting there alone thinking, well, how could I do this in a centered way, versus a group of leaders together. And then if that becomes your sort of, your default as you encounter a situation and you're like, okay, how are we going to do this in a centered way? So to your question, the churches that I've seen that have impressed me in making changes in this, it's through them getting a leader that's strongly upfront, in an upfront sense, communicating about it, but also that other leaders are brought into the language and conversation. So it's not just one person championing it. And and I should say, I mean, if clearly I think it's a great book, wish everyone would read it. But realistically, like, that is not going to happen. And that was why, when I made this book, because in contrast to some of my other books, where I sort of recognized, pastors or seminary students will read this, and that's the book is, and they have this conversation. Like, I knew for this to work, it needs to be more than that. And that is why I work with Jesus Collective to make this series of 5 videos that, like, small groups could use or something. Even if they don't read the book, it introduces them to the basics of it. So I commend that to you.
So maybe another question that I have is, you talk about membership in the book, and like groups trying to figure out how to navigate sorting through their membership understandings, ideologies, practices in a centered way. And each of us on this call kind of have different varying ways that we approach that. If we are in a place where we're going, hey, like, we are open to or wanting to, or I'm open to or wanting to rethink like how I understand membership, which in a very real sense is line drawing of some kind, right? And
right.
I think you would very quickly say that
right.
It's not all bad, right? And sometimes very necessary and needed. But what advice, or have you heard of or been in contact with anybody that has like shifted their membership ideologies, even theologies or practice around trying to be, more centered set in their approaches to that? And what has that look like? If so, what have been some of the positives, the negatives, the hurdles to watch out for?
Okay, so I have snapshots. I don't have the movie, right? So I have not followed someone through a whole process. And I think this is in the book. Yeah, it is in the book. So it was a Mennonite church in Kansas, and like, so the pastor, a former student, like, he was very committed that he wanted membership to be more centered. But he said to me, like, we're not in a place yet where we could make the changes I want to. So then what he did, or he and with some others, I mean, because he wasn't alone in want to do the centered thing, was okay, well, what's a mid thing that we can do that has some sense of, covenantal committing that we can do alongside of our membership. And so I just mentioned that right at the beginning to say, yeah, and this is too where I want to be sensitive with, your low church, and we low church have, a lot more freedom, but there's some denominations where, you're passing that, you don't have a lot of freedom on what membership is or it looks like. So then it is, well, hey, how to do it in a more centered way. Then I guess, let me think of another example. Yeah, so I don't know, I only know the end product with the vineyard churches in Colorado. But there was a very strong commitment of wanting to maintain membership, but do it in a different way. So yeah, I don't think I have a good process answer for you. The observation I would make, so this is more about me and process and writing the book. There were a few things going into it where I knew I needed some centered examples because they're the questions that people would always ask me. And one of them is membership, and another one was recovery ministry, and another one is children's ministry. And so I admit to you that I had low expectations in the sense of what I was looking for is I want to find some models of membership that aren't bounded. And which is, I think that's a good thing, but that's all I was hoping is something that's not bounded. And the same thing with recovery ministry, children's ministry. And in each case, what I found through interacting with people that were working on this is, there is so much more benefit to seeking to do membership in a centered way than just avoiding the negatives of bounded. And so I think I may have started this project, maybe, agnostic on membership, like it, a lot of people don't have membership and others do. And it wasn't a big deal for me. And I now am much more pro membership because of interacting with the people that work to do membership in a centered way, because I came to see things gained through centered membership rather than just, well, let's avoid the negatives of bounded membership. And again, I learned this from others, but it's in the chapter, but, to ask the why question, why do you want membership? What's its purpose? And then to seek it, to have it be relational rather than institutional, and, use language of orientation. And so I think if you start with those kind of principles, and the person that told me the why question, he said, we decided the reason we're not membership is we want membership to support the process of discipleship in our church. And I think that just leads you to a very different place than if you're just sort of passively accepting, well, we have to have membership because, it determines who can vote at the meetings or something. Like it leads to a different place. So,
I've been in a process of trying to actually do some of this work. And most of these guys are aware on this call about that. But, historically, just to kind of tip the apple cart, historically, we've come from a theological center, and I say we, me, but where the line of demarcation is baptism, right? Regenerative baptism, believer's baptism. And that is the line that makes you a member of the body of Christ, which is the same as the member of any local expression of that. And so there was really no other nuance or opportunities for any. It was, I consider that to be a fairly bounded, very flat sort of understanding. So I've been in the process of trying to figure out, okay, if I'm not going to do that, what am I going to do, right? If, for instance, someone has had a different experience or has come to know and follow Jesus in perhaps some different way, am I okay with accepting a different line drawn somewhere else? And if so, how do we communicate this idea of membership, this idea of covenant together? If we are actually trying to commit to each other, but we don't necessarily share the same line of what it means to be together, how do we redraw that and what does that look like? And so we have started employing, it was actually completely coincidental. We started employing this idea of alignment. We started talking about this language of covenantal agreements, that we were going to utilize. I think really from the scriptures is kind of where I got this language of just saying, hey, like, even though we may have a different, like conversion experience or our entrance into the big C church of Jesus may be a little or a lot different. And again, that's its own conversation. How do we covenant together for the purposes of living out our faith in community to grow in our discipleship or whatever you said the other pastor just said, these kinds of things, like, and I think for me, we've started to really tweak our practices, our language, and it has been really, really tough sledding, if I'm honest. Like, it has been really tough personally, corporately, because like, it's just so hard. Like, you just keep wanting to go back to what has been so clearly defined, and it's so hard to consistently try to redefine something that's really deeply baked in. And obviously, that's not unique to my tradition or yours or any that is a nature
Yes.
of what it means to come
Right.
from a tradition. And
Right.
that's not all bad. There are great things that
Right.
we inherit from our traditions. But yeah, I think just, I guess, high level, like any systemic change from something that has been generationally transmitted or is a tradition that, and for us, actually, our tradition's very, very young, just barely a couple of generations old. And so, but it's obviously connected to something older, which is connected to something older, and so on and so forth. But just that ability to change, especially things that have been or feel like they are in the center, I think is really tough sledding and takes a lot of perseverance. And like you said, clarity. And I think that's what we've struggled with and I think that's what I really resonated with your book about originally, is I was like, oh, this is like providing language for the very thing that we're trying to do. Look, like, we're not the only ones. You're not feeling like you're hacking your way through the Amazon with a machete and you don't know where you're going.
Mhm.
And so I think I'd be interested to know, because I think these are some of the conversations I've been having with this cohort, is if, I'll you use the Christian pacifism example in the book and here on the call. And obviously that is something as well that I'm very much have been exploring and in the process of my own center has shifted, because I don't come from a historic peace church, right? I don't come from the Anabaptist stream where pacifism is like a central tenet theologically, as most traditions aren't that, right? And so I have shifted and clarified over the last many years, but I still remain in a context and a tradition and a heritage theologically that has not been that. And so we've been in the process of trying to change and even like trying to like explore and experience that change in a centered way, right? So anyways, it is a bit of a rabbit hole, but that's another conversation that I'm kind of undergoing and have been going through with my local congregation in the context here, but also even on a larger scale, and even conversations with some of these other gentlemen here on the call. So so when you brought that up in your book, I'm like, oh, this is certainly apt, but it's a helpful to see, like, okay, even when even as a leader or a pastor or whatever, somebody with relatively large amount of influence and decision making, authority or power or whatever, to still really try to be centered in my convictions and my presentation of my convictions to others, right? That it is that invitation toward a well, rather than, hey, I know I'm right and everybody else needs to figure out how right I am, right? Which for some of us, personality wise, isn't always the easiest thing to do. Like Kyle, he really struggles with that a lot. So anyways, I guess in that, my question would be, would you have any, input or advice for me or for any of us in here as we're thinking about, hey, how do we embark upon, like, let's just, whether it's membership or some theological issue like pacifism or conversion doctrines, right? Whatever they may be, trying to approach them in perhaps a more centered way than what we have in the past. Like how would you recommend kind of some best first steps besides reading your book, of course?
So I think I think one, yeah, and this is an example of something that this was something that someone shared in a discussion time at I think it was Evangelical Covenant Midwest region retreat I spoke at last year. And he made the observation, thinking about defining the center. And he said, it seems to me the center, it's a bit like a Venn diagram in that in your congregation, there can be things that people disagree about. And so go with Christian pacifism. In a Mennonite tradition, they're saying, oh, this is the the overlapping part. This is in the overlapping part of a Venn diagram. Like, we think this is something that everyone in this congregation needs to affirm, or, as the example in the book, at least be heading towards. But in another church, like, yeah, I mean, right now I'm going to a church. There's no Mennonite churches in Portland, Maine. So I'm going to a church where that's not part of the center of their Venn diagram. Well, I don't feel like it's my job to try to come into that church and tell all of them they have to be, Christian pacifists. That should be part of their center. But to recognize, but also that I can feel like I can still hold that conviction. Like, that is I don't even want to say central fundamental conviction of mine, but I recognize in this particular church I'm going to, it is not part of the overlapping in a Venn diagram. And so, and maybe even back to what Steve was talking about, that might be helpful as well too, to be, as you're wrestling with things, to be discerning what are things that for our church that we need to agree this is part of the overlapping center. Or another image for a similar thing, and this is again from Megan Good, pastor in Arizona, and she said she likes to think of it as a bullseye, and the further rings you go out from the bullseye, the less important it is for everyone to agree. But there are things that are the bullseye. And then I really appreciated too that she said, because this is where, again, she's not fuzzy. She said, no, let me back up a second. Back to, that person was upset with me that was critiquing centered set. I think he made the error of thinking that because there was this tension about the center in a denomination, that the problem was it was these centered people. Whereas I say, hey, like, people come to different positions, and there are times in an organization, in a church, in a denomination, to say, we have different centers. And then that doesn't mean, if I'm going to be gracious and Christ-like, I don't then say, and you're a reprobate, a heretic. It's like, we disagree on this. But in all humility, this is really important to us. And you disagree, this is probably not the place for you. But it seems to me, John, as you're doing this wrestling, is corporately to make that distinction between, what are bullseye things that we need to hold together, and then what are things in the outer things that we can walk with together but have disagreement, or what's the overlapping of the Venn diagram. And I'll stop there.
Yeah, no, that's good. Thank you. Anybody else have anything pressing on their mind that they would like to engage Mark with before we kind of round out this call? Looks like you covered it all, Mark. Answered everybody's questions. I'm super grateful for you being here. I look forward to hopefully being able to continue to connect. Obviously, I think your work has helped me a lot, and I know helped many others. I think it's helped this group and several others that have been a part of this cohort for the last several months. Just to get us to kind of think and to have some language to some things that maybe we're feeling and be able to wrestle through, like, what does this centered way look like in our particular context, and doing the hard work of trying to figure out, that core, that center for ourselves personally and the groups that we're with. And I'll definitely try to hook you up with Steve, who's in your area as well after this call. So
Please.
Thank you, Mark.
Yeah.
Any parting words that you have, Mark?
So yes. So I haven't put it up yet here, my new setting, but I had above my desk a picture of a pond with someone had thrown a stone into it, and then the ripples growing out. And yeah, I mean, Mark Baker, like, I'm not, Tim Keller or something, like, so, like, just me writing this book is not like making it happen, but I pray every morning that the ripples spread. And so, as I mentioned at the beginning, I have found people that have encountered this in variety of ecclesial settings have found it, really beneficial. So I would appreciate it if you would be part of helping the ripples spread, and even take a moment and think, who's someone else that I could, recommend this book to or these videos to, and let them know about it. I would appreciate that. And then again, just, thanks. It is so much better interacting with a group of people who have read the book, and we talk about that rather than me, spending the first 20 minutes, introducing the concepts and stuff. So thanks for doing the work of reading the book and bringing questions, which were, very good. And I think I'll pass on to John 2 things for you. So one is this talk about for an individual, treating themselves in center ways, that in relation to Kyle's question that you can watch. But then also I wrote a blog recently of things that I wish were in the book, things that I've encountered since the book came out. And probably a third of them you've heard me say right now, but I just thought of another one I was going to say, and I thought, well, I'll just, send you the list, and then you can have that.
Well, thank you so much, Mark. I appreciate it. And maybe that's a great segue for another call that I can do with you in the future.
Sure, certainly.